You wake up whenever your body feels ready. No alarm, no schedule, no place you have to be. You sit up, stretch, and ask yourself just one simple question. What do I feel like doing today? For almost all of human history, that wasn't some imaginary idea. That was just how every single morning worked for around 300,000 years. And the life that followed that question looked nothing like the life most of us live today. Right now, the average person spends about 90,000 hours of their life working. That's roughly a third of all the time you're awake handed over to a job. But for the vast majority of human history, jobs simply didn't exist. No employment, no paychecks, no boss, no career ladder to climb. So what were people actually doing all day back then? Let's start with what we actually know. Back in 1963, a researcher studied a group of people in Botswana who were still living in a way similar to how humans lived before farming existed. He found that adults spent about 2.5 days a week finding food, roughly 17 hours total. The rest of the time, they did whatever they wanted. Here's the interesting part. This same pattern shows up again and again in completely different groups in completely different parts of the world, from Africa to South America to Australia. Different environments, different continents, same result. People spent somewhere around 15 to 20 hours a week on things directly tied to survival. For comparison, you probably work double that. Now, some of you might be thinking, sure, but those are modern people living that way today. How do we know ancient humans actually lived like this too? Fair question. And the answer comes from bones. When researchers compare the skeletons of early hunter-gatherers to skeletons from early farming communities, the difference is huge. The farmers were shorter. Their bones show clear signs of poor nutrition. Their teeth were full of cavities from eating so much grain. Their spines show damage from constant repetitive labor. And they died younger. Meanwhile, the older hunter-gatherer skeletons show taller frames, stronger bones, healthier teeth, and far less joint damage. The bones tell a clear story. Life before farming actually involved less repetitive physical strain, not more. But maybe the most interesting evidence of all comes from something that shouldn't really exist if survival was a nonstop struggle. Art. Back in 1994, explorers discovered a cave in southern France filled with paintings created roughly 30,000 years ago. Horses, lions, rhinos, all drawn with real detail, shading, and a sense of motion. These weren't rough scribbles. This was skilled artwork that took real time and planning. Someone spent hours, maybe even days, deep inside a cave by firelight, painting animals on the walls. Not for food, not for survival, just for beauty, meaning, or simply because they wanted to. In another cave in South Africa, researchers found beads made from tiny seashells with holes carefully drilled through them, dated to around 100,000 years old, clearly meant to be strung together as jewelry. The nearest coastline was over 20 kilometers away. Someone walked a long round trip just to gather shells, then spent hours carefully drilling into each one using stone tools just to make something that looked nice. In 2008, researchers even found a 40,000-year-old flute carved out of a bird bone in Germany with finger holes spaced out with real precision. Whoever made it understood music and pitch and clearly put real time and thought into crafting it. Not for hunting, not for defense, for music. These aren't rare one-off discoveries either. Across Europe, Africa, and Asia, sites dating back over 100,000 years are filled with decorative items, tools that are far more detailed than necessary, and objects that clearly took hours of focused effort with no real survival benefit at all. This is what people were doing when they weren't out gathering food. They were creating things, decorating things, making the world around them a little more beautiful. So let's imagine what an actual day looked like back then. You wake up around sunrise, the fire from the night before is still glowing, someone tosses more wood on it, you eat leftovers from yesterday, maybe some meat, fish, nuts, or berries. Breakfast is a social moment. People talk, joke, and loosely figure out the day ahead, not because they have to, but because that's simply what people naturally do together. By mid-morning, a small group might head out to hunt or gather food. But here's the key detail. They didn't do this every single day. If the last hunt went well and there's already food stored, the whole group might just stay at camp. Some people might spend the morning working on tools instead, sharpening a spear, weaving a basket, or softening an animal hide. This wasn't work in the way we think of work today. No clock, no manager watching over them. People did it because being skilled at something mattered, because doing things well earned respect, and because making things was simply part of being human. When hunting did happen, it wasn't the wild chase scene you'd see in a movie. Early humans were actually persistence hunters, meaning they would track an animal at a steady jog for hours until the animal overheated and finally collapsed. Humans are uniquely built for this, since we can sweat and cool ourselves down while moving, something most animals can't do nearly as well. So we simply outlasted them. A hunt like this might take anywhere from 3 to 6 hours, including travel. Afterward, the animal would be carried back, prepared, and shared among everyone. By early afternoon, the productive part of the day was basically finished. What happened after that is the part modern people usually find hardest to picture. Nothing much, and also everything. People rested. They sat in the shade and talked. They played with children. They groomed each other, going through each other's hair, which helped strengthen social bonds. They made jewelry out of shells, beads, or animal teeth. They carved little designs into bone or stone. Sometimes they just napped. One researcher documented that among a modern group still living this traditional lifestyle, adults spend roughly 6 hours a day in pure social time, not working, not sleeping, just being together, talking, laughing, and telling jokes. In a world with no money, no police, and no formal contracts, your entire survival depended on your relationships. If people didn't like you, they had no obligation to share food with you when you needed it. So people invested huge amounts of time into those relationships, not because it was efficient, but because that connection is genuinely part of what keeps humans functioning as humans. Then the sun sets and something interesting happens. One researcher who studied hundreds of hours of recorded conversation among a modern hunter-gatherer group found that during the day, most conversations were practical, things like where animal tracks were spotted, or which plants were ready to gather, or the occasional complaint about someone not sharing fairly. But at night, gathered around the fire, over 80% of the conversations shifted towards storytelling. Myths about how the world began. Tales about ancestors doing incredible things. Jokes that made everyone laugh. Stories about faraway places. Some researchers argue this nightly storytelling is actually where a big part of human culture was born. Ideas about God, spirits, the past, the future, the kinds of thoughts that only really surface once your stomach is full and you feel safe. People also didn't sleep the way most of us do today, in one long, uninterrupted block. Historical records and sleep studies both suggest that before artificial lighting existed, people commonly slept in two separate phases: a first sleep of around 4 hours, followed by 1 or 2 quiet, waking hours in the dark, then a second sleep of another 4 hours or so. So here's roughly what a full day actually looked like. About 4 to 6 hours spent gathering food or working on tools. About 6 hours spent connecting socially through storytelling, grooming, and play. About 8 hours of sleep broken into 2 separate phases. And the rest of the time simply resting, sitting, watching the sky, existing without needing to constantly prove your worth through being productive. Then, around 10,000 years ago, something shifted. In a region often called the Fertile Crescent, people began planting crops and raising animals on purpose. Agriculture had arrived, and agriculture turned out to be something of a trap. Once farming starts, you can feed more people. More people means you need even more food. More food means even more farming. Within a few generations, populations grew rapidly, and there was no going back because now there were simply too many people to feed through hunting and gathering alone. Everyone was locked into this new system, and farming required a lot more labor. Plowing fields, planting seeds, pulling weeds, harvesting crops, storing food, protecting it from animals and raiders. The skeletal evidence backs this up clearly. Early farmers worked harder, ate a less varied diet, and died younger than the hunter-gatherers who came before them. But populations kept climbing anyway. And with bigger populations came new roles: tool makers, potters, weavers, inventors, and eventually soldiers, priests, administrators, and finally something entirely new: jobs, employment. The idea that your time now belonged to someone else in exchange for resources. By the time cities were built, that original way of living was gone completely, replaced by schedules, obligations, and the need to spend most of your waking hours working just to get by within the system we'd built for ourselves. Today, the average person spends around 90,000 hours of their life working. Our ancient ancestors spent a fraction of that. You sleep in one solid block and call it insomnia if you wake up at 2 a.m. They slept in two natural phases and simply used those quiet middle hours to rest or reflect. Many of us spend our whole lives chasing an idea of success, achievement, and wealth defined by modern society. They woke up each morning already feeling enough, already at peace, with nothing they needed to prove to anyone. They didn't need to become successful. In a way, they were already living the kind of life a lot of people today are working their entire lives, just trying to eventually retire into. Today, you might make art if you can squeeze in the time after work. They made art simply because they had the time to. That's genuinely part of what humans naturally do. We're not a different species from them. But the way most of us live today is so different from how humans lived for the overwhelming majority of our existence that it might as well be a different world entirely. Somewhere along the way, we traded freedom for food security, leisure for population growth, and time for constant productivity.